Good morning or good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this important and timely program. My name is John Weingart, and I'm Associate Director of the Eagleton Institute of Politics, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker and our moderator today, both of whom are part of the Eagleton Institute. Professor Saladin Ambar is an Associate Professor of Political Science and Senior Scholar at the Eagleton Center on the American Governor. Before coming to Rutgers, Dean's career included years as a beloved history teacher at Princeton High School. I also want to note that Dean was just selected by New Jersey Spotlight to be their new opinion columnist with his first essay posted just this last week. Dean's research interests include race and American politics, the presidency, and the office of the governor. His latest book, American Cicero, Mario Cuomo and the Defense of American Liberalism, is on the political career of former New York Governor Mario Cuomo, whose son also entered politics, we understand. Our conversation today is centered on another of his books, Malcolm X at Oxford Union, Racial Politics in a Global Era. As the moderator for today's program, we are fortunate to have Emahunn Rahim Ali Campbell. Dr. Campbell is a third-year law student at Rutgers Law School in Newark and also an Eagleton Fellow. In addition, he is a Conoy Stavis Fellow and Social Equity Director for the Student Bar Association. He has interned at the Center for Constitutional Rights and the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, and has had a number of leadership roles with the Association of Black Law Students. Emahunn is also a former educator and held positions at Framingham State University, University of Massachusetts, and Washington and Lee University. His doctorate is from the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of African American Studies. As you know, today's conversation revolves around Professor Ambar's book, Malcolm X at the Oxford Union, focuses on the speech given at this 1964 debate. Today's program was made possible by the generous support of our Future of Democracy sponsors, and for that we thank you. I think the leaders of these organizations are with us this morning: the Rutgers Center for Social Justice Education and LGBT Communities, and Rutgers Paul Robeson Cultural Center. Before I pass the program off to Dr. Campbell, we have a short clip of Malcolm's 1964 speech, which we'd like to share. Thank you both, Professor Ambar and Dr. Campbell.
Mr. Chairman, tonight is the first night that I've ever had an opportunity to be as near to conservatives as I am. And the speaker who preceded me, first I want to thank you for the invitation to come here to the Oxford Union. The speaker who preceded me is one of the best excuses that I know to prove our point concerning the necessity sometimes of extremism in defense of liberty, why it is no vice, and why moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. I don't say that about him personally, but that type is He's right. X is not my real name. But if you study history, you'll find why no black man in the Western Hemisphere knows his real name. Some of his ancestors kidnapped our ancestors from Africa and took us into the Western Hemisphere and sold us there. And our names were stripped from us, and so today we don't know who we really are. I'm one of those who admit it, and so I just put X up there to keep from wearing his name. And as far as this apartheid charge that he attributed to me is concerned, evidently he has been misinformed. I don't believe in any form of apartheid. I don't believe in any form of segregation. I don't believe in any form of racialism. But at the same time, I don't endorse a person as being right just because his skin is white. And oftentimes when you find people like this I mean that tight. When a man whom they have been taught is below them has the nerve or firmness to question some of their philosophy or some of their conclusions, usually they put that label on us, a label that is only designed to project an image which the public will find distasteful.
You make my point. That as long as a white man does it, it's all right. A black man is supposed to have no feelings. But when a black man strikes back, he's an extremist. He's supposed to sit passively and have no feelings, be nonviolent, and love his enemy. No matter what kind of attack, be it verbal or otherwise, he's supposed to take it. But if he stands up and in any way tries to defend himself, then he's an extremist. No, I think that the speaker who preceded me is getting exactly what he asked for. My reason for believing in extremism, intelligently directed extremism, extremism in defense of liberty, extremism in quest of justice, is because I firmly believe in my heart that the day that the black man takes an uncompromising step and realizes that he's within his rights when his own freedom is being jeopardized, to use any means necessary to bring about his freedom or put a halt to that injustice, I don't think he'll be by himself. I live in America where there are only 22 million blacks against probably 160 million whites. One of the reasons that I am in no way reluctant or hesitant to do whatever is necessary to see that black people do something to protect themselves, I honestly believe that the day that they do, many whites will have more respect for them, and that there will be more whites on their side than are now on their side with these little wishy-washy love thy enemy approach that they've been using up to now. And if I'm wrong, then you are racialists.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to see a very sizable audience joining us for this conversation. Or as I told Professor Ambar backstage, this jam session that we're going to be having on Malcolm X, because it's always a wonderful time when folks can get together to talk about Malcolm El Hajj Malik El Shabazz's life, or popularly known as Malcolm X. So we're going to go right into it. How you doing, Professor?
Let me unmute myself here. I'm doing well, brother. It's so good to be with you.
Likewise. Yes, I'm all right. I'm hanging in there, looking forward to this conversation. So let's get right into it. So for me, I'm going to come out and say it. You know, Malcolm is the most influential political figure in the second half of the 20th century, from shaping the Black arts movement, how influential he was for some of the artists there, the Black Power movement, the Black student movement, the ethnic studies movement, moving all the way through to Afrocentrism. And I would even say the Black Lives Matter movement now would look differently if it wasn't for Malcolm El Hajj Malik El Shabazz's life and what he contributed to the Black freedom struggle. But with that, there's also this book right here that you wrote, all right? And what you do is you go into a sea of like Malcolm X studies. And what I mean by that is there have been so many books written on Malcolm that of course precede yours, but you offered this interesting contribution of Malcolm X at this period in his life. And so I'm curious, why write this book about Malcolm X, particularly this period when he's at Oxford Union?
Well, to be honest, and again, it's great to be with you, brother. And I thank those who are listening wherever you are. Welcome and appreciate you joining us. This came out of a kind of area of shadow knowledge, let's call it that, in terms of my own understanding of Malcolm's life. You know, I had taught American political thought. I taught Black political thought, and I've gone through many Malcolm speeches just in my own personal life, and then certainly as an academic. But I remember coming across, this is when I was teaching Black political thought, and I was looking to teach some of Malcolm's writing, speeches, and of course the usual suspects came up, the Ballot or the Bullet, Message to the Grassroots. And every now and then I'd see in my searches the Oxford speech, but I'd never really heard it 100% all the way through. I'd never really done a personal study of it. And the more I dug into the actual speech, but also the timing in terms of what was going on in the United States, what was going on in the UK. I also had no knowledge that Malcolm had spoken in Paris a week before the Oxford Address. It became clear to me that there was a story emerging about not only Malcolm and his thinking at this time, post-Hajj to be sure, but also thinking about taking his show on the road, if you will, to European countries and the Black diaspora there. It became clear to me that there was a lot going on in this moment, what I sometimes describe as this Oxford moment, where the Black and brown populations of Europe are experiencing their own, hate and there was great, tremendous volatility and assaults on their personhood. So Malcolm went there and made these connections, as he so often did, to the Black freedom struggle in the United States. And I said to myself, there's a book here. Really, you come to that conclusion at some point, whether there's a book here or not. And it was evident to me from the research that there was a lot to say about where Malcolm was and what was going on in '64 at this time.
Absolutely. And so what's fascinating also about that, what you just offered, is that Malcolm, his travel to Europe follows a long line of Black luminaries and activists traveling to Europe before him, from Langston Hughes to Du Bois, Richard Wright, James Baldwin, who was his contemporary at the time. And so Malcolm is engaged now in this politics in his separation from the Nation of Islam and really developing his own kind of political thought. But you talk about Malcolm going specifically to Oxford and being in Paris. If you could set the scene for us, all right? So how does Malcolm end up in Oxford, at Oxford Union? How does he end up in Paris? Of course, he went on his Hajj. He's meeting with African leaders, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But how does he end up at Oxford Union?
Well, it really is customary at Oxford for the president of the union there, the student organization, which is not quite directly affiliated with the university, but for all intents and purposes has a place in the university's life, for the university president to invite a guest speaker during his or her term. And it so happened that there was a second Black person who was president of the Oxford Union at that time, Eric Anthony Abrams. And Tony, as he was often known on campus, reached out to Malcolm. He had come across his writings, his speeches, and who he was. And people at Oxford were very unfamiliar with Malcolm X. He was not the cause celeb that he was here in the States. And guess what? They were like, oh, sure, you want to invite this bloke? Go right ahead, But then word eventually got out who Malcolm X was, and it created quite a stir. Malcolm accepted. He received no honorarium, just his flight. You wonder what Malcolm X would command in terms of honorarium today, right? It's a different time. People were just a very different kind of time in terms of what we're talking about in terms of public speaking. But he showed up a few days in advance, got to meet with students and the president, Tariq Ali, who would become the president of the Oxford Union the following year. He spent quite a bit of time with Malcolm on campus. And so the rationale was that, first of all, the BBC gave Malcolm X an opportunity, a platform to be broadcast, to broadcast his views to the UK and throughout the British Commonwealth. So that was an important thing right there. And in fact, they said, Malcolm X, you are not allowed to do any interviews before you speak on to the BBC audience. So that was interesting, but that was a powerful opportunity because Malcolm was so often had his speeches and language cut up and edited. And there was some of that with the BBC, but they also provided an extensive window of time where you just got to hear him speak. So that was important. And Malcolm was trying to, again, connect the Black freedom struggle in America to the international movement, what he called the Black Revolution. And then finally, he was also interested in thinking about taking the United States to the UN for violating the human rights of Black people in the United States. And so the international opportunities that were present in the Oxford moment, and indeed in Paris, were quite powerful to him.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that last point about Malcolm bringing the Black freedom struggle and the discrimination and the anti-Blackness that Black people experience in the United States to the United Nations. Because in many ways, as you describe in the book, Malcolm precedes, for example, Martin Luther King when it comes to globalizing the Black freedom struggle, at least in terms of Martin's early articulation about the civil rights of Black people. And so Malcolm is engaged in kind of, anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism, before Martin actually makes a public declaration about it. And so going in that direction of the politics globalizing the Black freedom struggle, talk to us about the politics surrounding Malcolm in the UK. So, of course, I spoke about a little bit in Africa, the African independence movement, Patrice Lumumba. He talks about, of course, the Congo in the Oxford Union discussion. But also you write about Smethwick. You also talk about the politics that are happening in the UK. Winston Churchill, one of his suggested slogans, keep England white. And then one of the most powerful quotes that you offer is, if you want a nigger neighbor, vote Labour. So there are some interesting anti-Black politics that are happening in the UK. Talk to us about a little bit of that.
Well, there's a lot to what you said. First and foremost, the United Kingdom in 1964 has an election. And they're looking to elect a new prime minister and a new set of members of parliament, much the same way in 64, there's a United States election. And the Civil Rights Act is on the ballot, so to speak, with the election of Lyndon Johnson against Barry Goldwater. In fact, the motion for the debate, extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue, that came from a Goldwater statement during the Republican National Convention speech. But in the UK, we have some unrest because the Jamaican diaspora is growing, the South Asian, Pakistani, and Indian diaspora, the African diaspora is growing. In England, look, we know from Brexit that some of what took place today, meaning in recent years, yes, is about English or British sovereignty, but a good deal of it is about a backlash against immigration, feeling that the UK is too connected to the continent of Europe, both psychically, but also in terms of this racial transfer. So, Malcolm basically is in the mix in the UK at a moment when there's a great white backlash against people coming in from the Commonwealth, Black and brown folk coming in from the Commonwealth. And part of one of the parliamentary elections in Smethwick, an MP is purported to have said, if you want an English neighbor, if you want a nigger neighbor, vote Labour. He never denied saying it, in fact, and he wins. He wins the election. And Malcolm will visit Smethwick just a few weeks before he dies, maybe 10, 11 days before he's assassinated. He visits Smethwick and he's walking around the neighborhood looking at the for rent signs because what had happened in Smethwick was the city bought up these lots and refused to let them or rent them to Black and brown folks. And Malcolm was highlighting how that kind of struggle there was part and parcel of the so-called Negro struggle in America, as he so often described it. So, in fact, Lyndon Johnson telegraphs Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister of the UK, in 65 during the Watts Rebellion, and he says, look, what's taking place in America is the same thing. We have the same problem. Well, what's the problem? The problem is race. The problem is, are you willing to have a multiracial democratic society? Yes or no? Or are you going to thwart the will of Black and brown people in a fascistic, authoritarian way to keep England white, to keep America white? And the Churchill quote was from a 1955 cabinet meeting in which he tells Macmillan, is purported to have told Macmillan, a good slogan for the Conservative Party is to keep England white. And so, we think of Trumpism, and I don't mean to go there, but we think of Trumpism or modern so-called populism on the right as new. But much of this was taking place in the 50s and 60s. And that was what really attracted me to what Malcolm was saying at Oxford and really why he was there.
And it's in those moments where your book is incredibly prescient, because oftentimes, at least in the United States, we focus on the Southern strategy and we talk about how that's percolating and how it leads up to this moment that we're seeing now. But what your book offers is how, and some commentators have spoken about it, how this right-wing surge actually begins on a global level. It's not simply something that's couched in the United States, but it's happening in different locations across the world. And so your book is really, really on top of that and seeing kind of like how these things are developing. So now let's go into the Oxford Union with this. All right, so you offered us how the discussion begins with what Goldwater states, of course, at the Republican National Convention. But we also know, like, what your book does is it challenges in some ways this notion that Malcolm is an extremist. And of course, he's there to defend, the extremist position. But you offer something very interesting. One of the lines you say is Malcolm moves from being he goes post-Black nationalist to but is anti-post-Blackness. And so talk to us about the moderation, the term that you use, the moderation of Malcolm's politics, both in terms of race and in terms of the larger human rights struggle.
Look, I think it's fair to say that Malcolm, post-Nation of Islam, is no longer a racial absolutist, no longer a racial essentialist, which is to say he doesn't believe that there's anything inherent in white skin that prevents whites from becoming revolutionary and becoming allied humanistically with Black people and anyone else on the planet. So I think he's no longer a racial essentialist. He begins to question Black nationalism in his diary and elsewhere because he meets someone, an Algerian revolutionary, who is for all intents and purposes white. And he says, well, what does that do for me? I've been fighting the hell out of the French here for years. What are you talking about? Am I not a revolutionary because I'm white? Where does your Black nationalism leave me? And so I think what begins to happen is Malcolm always had, really, even in his early days and period with the Nation of Islam, had an international perspective. He had traveled to Saudi Arabia himself in 1959. What's new is that he is now politically and willing to be politically engaged with the Black and brown diaspora. And I do think, had he lived, and I know we don't like to speculate in this way, but I do think had he lived, he would have had European and other audiences, white audiences, gravitate towards his thinking, in part because he was speaking about toppling white supremacy and the psychology of it, the economics of it, the politics of it. And as he alludes to at the end of the Oxford Address, I don't care what color skin you are, so long as you're willing to change the miserable conditions that exist on this earth, then there's a place for you. So I think that was an evolution in Malcolm. However, he was, as you say, not post-racialist. This was not some post-racial, post-Black theory of who we are as Americans or anyone else around the world. So long as white supremacy was integral to the American framework or the British framework or any other framework around the world, then it had to be assaulted, and Blackness had to be affirmed. And affirmed psychically, aesthetically, as you alluded to, culturally, politically, and economically. So I think moving beyond Black nationalism, as sometimes is often suggested by some, did not mean, an effacement of his Black political agenda. I think that that's important.
And absolutely. And I'm thinking here about the ways in which Malcolm still centralizes Blackness in toppling white supremacy. He goes from, of course, during his period in the Nation of Islam, referring to white people as the devil, to actually referring to systems of oppression, particularly white supremacy, as the devil. So he goes from an individualistic analysis in some ways to a more systemic analysis in how it operates throughout the world. And so now going a little deeper into the debate or to the discussion, what's interesting that you offer is that you provide a number of figures. You pair Malcolm with Barack Obama. The famous line that's associated with Malcolm is "by any means necessary," and typically that's been read as, oh shoot, Malcolm's extreme. He's talking about violence. But as you lay out in the book, Malcolm is actually talking about whatever gets us to the point of ending white supremacy and bringing about a certain kind of Black self-determination is what I'm for. And so talk to us about the politics, particularly of Malcolm's discussion in the debate, the phrase "by any means necessary," linking him with someone like Barack Obama and his Oslo speech once he got the Nobel Peace Prize, and then also his notion of liberty that he pairs with Patrick Henry.
Wow, I appreciate that question. So, when people hear "by any means necessary," most people hear "by any means," but they don't hear the necessary. Malcolm's, willingness to uphold violence in terms of self-defense was always as a last resort, and he was never personally associated with violence. So I think that's an important thing to acknowledge. Never carried a weapon until the very last weeks of his life, when his life was under constant threat. So I think that that's an important point to make. I think with respect to how this applied in the Oxford debate, he was advocating that, people in the Congo had a right to defend themselves. African nations who had been colonized or were subject to colonialism or war or the dropping of bombs had a right to defend themselves by any means necessary. And that Black people in the United States had a right to defend themselves. Look, Malcolm in so many words says, I've been your best student. I've been to social studies classes and I know about Patrick Henry and how you teach about Nathaniel Green, the swamp fox, and, guerrilla war. You don't teach white people nonviolence. You love to teach Black people nonviolence. And the point he made about the Stanleyville massacre and what took place in the Congo wasn't so much an advocacy of violence, but the rationale being that people have a right to defend themselves. And he brought up in the debate, just as the UK dropped bombs on Germany and Germans dropped bombs on London, that was war, but you rationalize that, but you won't give me the right and our people the right just to strike back at some police officer who has his foot on our neck. And the audience didn't like that, and they challenged him at Oxford on that point. But he ultimately, held his ground and argued again that in so many words, I'm the man you would be in a similar condition. Would you be passive if the police were, brutalizing you? If you didn't have the right to vote, would you be passive? And so really Malcolm is, as I argue, is just simply suggesting that Black people have a right to righteous indignation and anger and fury. They have a right. Look, we saw on January 6th at the Capitol that a whole cadre of people stormed the Capitol under the mistaken belief that somehow the election was stolen. But what were they fearing? Not the loss of their vote per se, although that was ostensibly it. What, that Joe Biden was going to provide, an expansion of Medicare for all? I don't know what. But Malcolm was dealing with an actual subjugated class of people, subjugated on the basis of the color of their skin, who were denied equal rights. And under that scenario, the argument was you have a right to, as John Locke called it, appeal to heaven. As Jefferson suggested, you have a right, after a long train of abuses, to throw off the shackles of your oppression. And so Malcolm was familiar with American history. He loved the Patrick Henry line, and it got quite a laugh and some applause at Oxford, a good deal of applause. So I think that these are important, touchstones for that moment. And also there are reminders of what we're experiencing even now, as Black people seem to be perennially the only Americans who are instructed in sort of Gandhian nonviolence. I haven't heard anyone, talk about, Lindsey Graham needs a course in nonviolence because he, or any other American politician or group of people. And I think that was the thorn in the side of Malcolm, just irritated him to no end. as it should have.
Yes, yes. And what's really interesting about that is Malcolm really gets to the heart of it, as you described, which essentially is to say that if a Black person does it, it's fundamentally and immediately understood as violent, as wrong, as subversion. But when a white person does it, or when white people do it, then it's legitimate. And you, as I mentioned before, you also pair him with Barack Obama, and Barack Obama talks about this in his Nobel speech, prize acceptance, and he talks about the way in which, for example, America, we hold these ideals, but if we have to resort to violence, we will. And so I see in your text an attempt to demonstrate how Malcolm is challenging fundamentally how when extremism is articulated through Blackness, it somehow becomes immediately subversive, immediately violent, as opposed to it being something that has been a part of a long arc of American history and is a part of, in some ways, American foreign policy. I wanted to ask you about, okay, well, of course, we're 2 days separated from Malcolm's assassination, his murder in Harlem at the Audubon Ballroom. We know how some of the coverage went when it came to Malcolm's death, his murder in the United States. But you also talk about the UK response to Malcolm's death. Could you give us a glimpse of how the UK and the international world responded to Malcolm's murder?
If you look at the what students had to say about him, students from the London School of Economics who he met with on his next visit to the UK, if you look at what Tariq Ali said about how he and his fellow undergrads at Oxford felt once they learned Malcolm was assassinated, they were mournful, man. Tariq Ali said, we cried in our beers, and Tariq was not a practicing Muslim, despite the name and being from Pakistan. They were crying in their beers in the pubs in England for the students who got to know him. And he met a number of students in his travels. There was a great deal of appeal for young people, Black and white alike. So I think that was one response. Of course, the official responses of places, like the London Times and, Le Monde and the more mainstream corporate media of Europe was ostensibly, was in so many words, good riddance. He was a man of hate. The New York Times, posting of Malcolm's prostrate body on the front cover in his dying moments was a signal, I think, to what happens to outspoken Negroes. You would never seen a picture of Kennedy lying, dead on the cover of the New York Times in the moments after his assassination. But there was a kind of euphoria, if I could use that word, I think in the coverage almost, a disdain and anger and hostility in our coverage here in the States, but also around the world for Malcolm's death. I think it's important to remember that. But I think younger people, and of course there were socialist newspapers at the time that had a very different take and felt Malcolm was gravitating towards socialism. There was some of that, and they were very positive towards him. But ultimately, like so much of so many lives of import, the growth of Malcolm historically has been interesting to see, particularly in the Black diaspora around Europe, but around the world, but also the Arab and Muslim diaspora and other diasporic people who, people of color, frankly, who have recognized the revolutionary spirit of Malcolm. And of course, much of this has been, as Brother Hisham Aidi at Columbia University has chronicled, through hip hop. So much of Malcolm's legacy has been sustained through hip hop and a cultural legacy after his death, that I think those early responses have been minimalized, because there's something about, you could call it the rebelliousness. I would just say the affirmation of personhood that says, you reach a point where I'm not going to take it anymore, that people respond to. And I think that's a powerful feature of his legacy.
Absolutely. And I think that a part of that legacy is the defiance he represented for many younger Black folks during the time in which he lived. And I think we see some of that attractiveness when it comes to Malcolm, even today, that the defiance he represented, speaking out against police brutality, speaking out against anti-Black violence and so on. I think you see that, and it resonates with a lot of folks. I wanted to shift gears just for a second. So before the conversation, I was telling folks like, okay, so my name, Emahunn Rahim Ali Campbell, it emerges as a part of a kind of historical energy of Malcolm's influence among Black Muslims. My father is a Muslim, so as Manny Marable describes in his biography of Malcolm, Malcolm plays a critical role in Islam and Islam's role in the Black community. And also, as you describe in your book, Malcolm plays a role in terms of your name as well. So I'm curious, what does Malcolm personally mean to you, especially in the course of writing the book?
Look, Malcolm was the specter that hung over Black youth in New York City, Philly, Chicago, big cities, LA, but certainly New York. In the time I was coming into adulthood, manhood, in the 1980s, Malcolm hung there like a specter. And at some point you had to either come to grips with who this guy was and take him on or let him alone. I had, relatives who were Muslim, who had not necessarily heard Malcolm speak, but who had been influenced by the Nation of Islam, had heard Malcolm, and I knew nothing. I was like, most 13-year-olds. My cousin sat me in the projects and said, "Well, what do you know about Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey?" I don't know. And he shamed me, man. And so I went on a hunt and picked up a bunch of books. And my name, Saladin Ambar. Malik Ambar came out of a book that Malcolm was very familiar with called World's Great Men of Color, about an Ethiopian brother who wound up a Mughal ruler in India. So, that period of time for me, particularly as someone who, was dealing with my own, as you would at 13, 14, 15, your own insecurities, your own sin, and, and also, I'm multiracial, biracial, whatever. My mom is of Italian descent. I'm in the middle of applying for Italian citizenship. But who I was in terms of my Blackness was like, Malcolm spoke to an affirmative side of my Blackness and of my African history. I didn't have to believe that, I had not contributed, or my people or Black people had never contributed anything to history. I didn't have to believe when I sat in a classroom that somehow I was less than. I had a real affirmation of who I was through Malcolm. And look, even now as an adult, even as someone who's years old, I think it's important to recognize that Malcolm is still that specter, who asks, why are you doing this? Are you doing this to please white folks? Are you doing this? What's going on with you? He really is he speaks to your backbone as a Black person. He really compels you to take, Dr. King did what he did, but part of what Malcolm did was assert your conscious Blackness as a value added to humanity. And if you run from it, it's almost like he's whispering in your ear. What are you doing? What do you think you're doing? And so that is a powerful elixir to white supremacy, to have inhaled the Malcolm X, to have inhaled a lot of the teachings of the Nation of Islam, and in terms of an affirmation of Blackness, and Black history and culture and identity. So that was significant, and he remains significant even now.
Absolutely. And so for me, I hear you answer that question. I remember when I started on the path of my PhD, one of the first books I read was Malcolm X Speaks, and just, reading through the speeches. And, of course, former Attorney General Eric Holder, he said that, he would tell young Black men coming up in the world, young Black boys coming up in the world, the book that I would want you to read is the autobiography of Malcolm X, one of the, of course, most popular autobiographies, not only in the country, but in the world. And so you have this legacy of Malcolm X that, as you said, looms large like a specter, but at the same time, it's something that's so grounding. It's something that provides individuals, especially Black folks, with the sense of globalizing the Black freedom struggle, not just nationalizing it to the United States, and of course has shaped us personally. So I want to now offer a clip of Malcolm, and then what we're going to do, we want the audience to type in your questions in the chat. I already see one question right now, but would love a number of other questions about Malcolm, about the process of writing the book, anything that comes to mind in terms of this discussion. But on to our next clip, and then we'll wrap things up with some questions.
If they can't enforce this law, they'll never enforce those laws. So my contention is that we are faced with a racialistic society, a society in which they are deceitful, deceptive, and the only way we can bring about a change is to talk the kind of language, speak the language that they understand. The racialist never understands a peaceful language. The racialist never understands the nonviolent language. The racialist, he's spoken his language to us for 400 years. We have been the victim of his brutality. We are the ones who face his dogs that tear the flesh from our limbs, only because we want to enforce the Supreme Court decision. We are the ones who have our skulls crushed, not by the Ku Klux Klan, but by policemen, only because we want to enforce what they call the Supreme Court decision. We are the ones upon whom water hoses are turned with pressure so hard that it rips the clothes from our back. Not men, but the clothes from the backs of women and children. You've seen it yourself. Only because we want to enforce what they call the law. Well, anytime you live in a society supposedly based upon law, and it doesn't enforce its own law because the color of a man's skin happens to be wrong, then I say those people are justified to resort to any means necessary to bring about justice where the government can't give them justice. I don't believe in any form of unjustified extremism, but I believe that when a man is exercising extremism, a human being is exercising extremism in defense of liberty for human beings, it's no vice. And when one is moderate in the pursuit of justice for human beings, I say he's a sinner. And I might add in my conclusion, in fact, America is one of the best examples when you read its history about extremism. Old Patrick Henry said liberty or death. That's extreme. Very extreme. I read once, passingly, about a man named Shakespeare. I only read about him passingly, but I remember one thing he wrote that kind of moved me. He put it in the mouth of Hamlet, I think it was, who said, to be or not to be. He was in doubt about something. Whether it was nobler in the mind of man to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, moderation, or to take up arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing, end them. And I go for that. If you take up arms, you'll end it. But if you sit around and wait for the one who's in power to make up his mind that he should end it, you'll be waiting a long time. And in my opinion, the young generation of whites, blacks, browns, whatever else there is, you're living at a time of extremism, a time of revolution, a time when there's got to be a change. People in power have misused it, and now there has to be a change, and a better world has to be built, and the only way it's going to be built is with extreme methods. And I, for one, will join in with anyone, don't care what color you are, as long as you want to change this miserable condition that exists on this earth. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're going to go to some questions from the audience now, Professor. All right, so let's start with the first one. This comes from Jeffrey Davis. Though asking how Malcolm X is similar to or different from Martin Luther King Jr. May seem simple at first blush, maybe it's not that easy to answer. Though differences between the two may be stark to the non-historian, how did the Black population at the time relate to them? That is, did their followers overlap?
I think, yeah, well, we remember Malcolm really spoke primarily to the conditions of Black people in the North. Dr. King, until 1965 and 66, when he started to visit Chicago, didn't really address the issues of Black people in the North. And around 65, 66, 67, you hear King starting to talk a lot more like Malcolm. He says, I'm not going to tell Black people, in Watts to be nonviolent when I'm going to talk to my government, which is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. And that's in 1967 at Riverside Church in Harlem. So, you hear, and you also hear Dr. King talking about loving your Black hair and your Black features. It's like he just took a course on Malcolm near the end of his life. And of course, King's opposition to the Vietnam War. Malcolm had long opposed the Vietnam War before it became the Vietnam War, So, and I think certainly at the time there was some overlap, but I think, look, they were feared for different reasons. There were a lot of Black people who wanted no part of Malcolm X. There were also a lot of, safe Negroes who wanted no part of the civil rights movement, wanted no part of Dr. King. We forget, that Dr. King, among whites, but even among some African Americans, a little bit of, I don't know if I want all this protesting, I think Malcolm was much more the villain and vilified, to be sure. And I think he used that, as he did in Selma, to support the civil rights movement in 65 by telling Coretta King, look, I'm down here not to hurt, but to help. They'll give your husband what he wants if they know that if they don't, they're going to have to deal with me. So, there was that kind of outside game of politics going on there, but there was some overlap, not a whole lot. I think the overlap has come with time, as there's been a greater appreciation for the fact that Malcolm's radicalism was in some ways embraced, I would say. We don't really have discussion, but embraced by Dr. King, not in the same way, not in that Dr. King ever advocated or supported violence, but in terms of an affirmation of Blackness, and certainly an affirmation of the unjust foreign policies of the United States, the unjust economic conditions that we had perpetuated over time. I think that's where we begin to see a confluence of King and Malcolm in King's latter years. And that's only, I think that confluence and that overlap has only grown with time.
Absolutely. I mean, I think about Martin Luther King's final speech, April 3rd, 1968. He begins it where he says, whether it's Johannesburg, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, New York City, Atlanta, Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi, or Memphis, Tennessee, the cry is always the same: we want to be free. So, but Malcolm, as you just noted, Malcolm's talking about these connections, talking about South Africa in a very clear, explicit way, pointing out American hypocrisy in ways that Dr. King wasn't at the time. The second question, Professor Ambar, is you've mentioned previously the position put forth by those such as Manning Marable, that Malcolm, even prior to his time in prison, had a relatively coherent Black nationalist worldview. Could you comment on this, and perhaps the impact of his Garveyite parents, that the influence they had?
Sure. Look, I think Malcolm, I think it's fair to say that Malcolm exaggerated how lost he was before he got to the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, right? He wanted to show the stark contrast of I was a satanic figure, as he writes in the autobiography in the chapter Satan, and then I become a very different kind of person when I hear the teachings of the Nation of Islam. That's fine, but Malcolm's parents were Garveyites. They were Garvey preachers and traveled really into Canada and around the country, extolling the virtues of Marcus Garvey and Blackness, and there was an inherent politics in the household. So, Malcolm was not someone who, despite his, entry into a life of crime and being arrested, was not someone completely devoid of a sense of knowledge of self, as we would call it. He certainly had an experience with Black consciousness. Now, it was a different kind of experience. I think, look, the connection to Islam was fundamental for him. I do think we have to remember that both he and King were very deeply religious humans, deeply religious men, and their spiritual journey was critical to who they were and are, even now, encyclically, as we consider them. It's important to not lose sight of that Malcolm X, whatever he became, and however his politics were changing, his rootedness in Islam was fundamental to who he was, and that was an important contribution. And the politics of Blackness evolved post-prison, certainly, but he came in, I think, with a kind of seed ready to be cultivated, because his parents were deeply political and deeply pro-Black.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is that overlaps with the previous question, because, Malcolm X, Islam, as you described and other scholars have discussed, Islam broadens his understanding of the human rights struggle, just like Dr. King. Scholars have written how, first and foremost, Dr. King needs to be understood as a preacher. So religion is very deep and central to both of them and helps them understand the politics they're navigating and they espouse. Next question, Professor, and we might not be able to get to all of them. What was Malcolm's theory for pursuing social change? How do you think social change is best pursued and achieved? He says by any means necessary, but did he ever elaborate on which are the most effective and appropriate these means?
He did. And it was in a speech called The Ballot or the Bullet. And it was, unless we are to descend, the only thing that's going to prevent us from descending into a spiral of uncontrollable violence is the expansion of the Black vote. We need that vote. We need its power. And if we get it, then we have a means to support who we are in our communities. But absent that, then we're looking at chaos and we're looking at a bullet. We're looking at violence. We're looking at bloodshed. And we don't want to go there. So it's either the ballot or the bullets. He believed that firmly. And I think his interest in organizing politically was something that he was able to do. He didn't have much time to do it, obviously, because he was soon assassinated. But his interest in organizing politically was part of why he was in Europe. And he was setting up the Organization of Afro-American Unity offices in London and in Paris and possibly even in Amsterdam. That was why he was there, but also seeking to reconcile with civil rights groups in the United States. He had written letters to SNCC and the SCLC and all of the so-called Uncle Toms, right, that he had reviled, Reverend Chicken Wing. Malcolm was brutal in his assaults on civil rights leaders. But when he left the nation and decided that he wanted to take a different tack politically and was free to do so and engage politically, because he was not free to do so in the Nation of Islam because of their religious strictures of being apolitical, he wrote letters to the heads of civil rights leaders and said, look, literally said, I apologize for the things I have said about you. I want us to work together now. And these were documents that I had not seen before until I began researching for the book. So yes, political engagement and voting, first and foremost, were his method, I think.
Yeah, and one of the criticisms of Malcolm and the Nation of Islam during his time in the Nation of Islam was that, while you're calling these folks Uncle Toms, they're actually on the streets while the Nation of Islam is away. And of course, Malcolm, it's been well documented that he had some discontent with the Nation of Islam when a member of the Nation of Islam was brutally beaten in California, and the nation didn't do anything politically about that, at least outwardly. Unfortunately, we'll be able to get to all the questions, but just one more. So what are some of the beliefs and teachings of Malcolm that you believe are particularly relevant today and should be held close to our hearts? And I'll add to that a little bit as well. What's Malcolm's legacy? How do we understand Malcolm's legacy? You talk about, authentic revolutionary, but Malcolm's legacy and what teachings and beliefs are particularly relevant today when it comes to Malcolm X?
I think I'll share one because there's so many, and one because it's personal, and I think it gets at the heart of what has to take place before anything else can be addressed. So perhaps some of our listeners know that I am the father of triplets. And I remember when my wife at the time was pregnant, my niece, who's an African-American woman now, young girl at the time, maybe 11 or 12 at the time, maybe even younger, 10, found out that we were about to have these babies, and she said, "Oh, I hope they're light-skinned." Now, her parents didn't teach her that. Certainly, we didn't teach her that. Where did she pick that up? It's like the coronavirus. White supremacy is airborne. You know, you just inhale it. All you got to do is be around and breathe it. No one's got to teach it to you. You don't have to have surface contact. That thing is airborne. And what I would say, what Malcolm does and did, and what he continues to do, if you look in the mirror and you love yourself, you know what? Some of that is because Malcolm told you that's okay, that your black skin is beautiful, that your hair, the texture of your hair is beautiful, that your lips, your nose are beautiful, who you are, that you have a history, that you didn't come here with no history. And, you know, slavery 1619 is a good project, but you know what? You got a history that predates that. You got world contributions that predate that. Black self-love, we still need to teach that in the 21st century. And that's what Malcolm fundamentally, first and foremost, before you get to his politics, an affirmation of your humanity, your decency, loving self, not having to look, as Du Bois said in The Souls of Black Folk, through the eyes of whites for your affirmation, to end the world of double consciousness, but to become singularly conscious and love yourself for who you are. And the very fact that you are what you are, begin there. That in and of itself is its own revolution. I think that is chiefly Malcolm's first and foremost contribution, and everything else, you know, hey man, it's gravy.
Absolutely. So what we're gonna try to do is we're gonna try to squeeze in one more question, Professor, and then I'm just gonna offer some closing remarks, thanking our co-sponsors and thanking the audience, and of course thanking the Eagleton Institute. Okay, so this question is as an Arab American Muslim, Malcolm has also been a grounding force for me in understanding my own humanity and asserting myself and values. How do you believe his accepting of so-called mainstream Islam impacted his thoughts and writing? Malcolm didn't have many writings, but yeah.
I just think it extended, it helped further enable him to make connections to the Black freedom struggle, to those other human struggles around the world. Look, I met, I didn't meet, he's passed away, but I remember I met someone who knew Hugh McDermott, the Scottish poet who participated in the Oxford debate. And he was a Scottish nationalist, and Malcolm was a Black nationalist, and they met and they got along well. They would have become probably friends had Malcolm lived. But I remember Tariq Ali, who I interviewed for the book, said when he spoke to Hugh McDermott, McDermott said to him, "Do you know the two words that McDermott used to describe Malcolm X?" And I said, "No, what were those words?" Authentic revolutionary. And I think Islam, and Islam that was broad enough to encompass people irrespective of race, and to embrace the possibility of human brotherhood in all of its dimensions, irrespective of race, gave Malcolm an entree into that kind of revolutionary spirit that would link the oppressed peoples around the world one to another. And I think that was the gift there.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor Ambar. We're wrapping things up. Listen, I enjoyed this discussion, man. Like this, man, and like I'm gonna be honest with you, this thing could keep going. I think if we had another hour or so, we'd be getting into some other things, and it would be a good time. I want to just quickly thank, of course, the Eagleton Institute for sponsoring this conversation. I thank Professor Ambar for this conversation, the Rutgers Center for Social Justice Education and the LGBTQ communities, and Rutgers Paul Robeson Cultural Center for being co-sponsors, and also the folks in the audience. We really appreciate you taking the time to be in space, be in conversation with me and Professor Ambar. And I'm going to leave the final words to Professor Ambar before we close out.
Well, I was just taking a peek at some people I know and some I don't know in the chat room. I want to thank you for being here. I love and respect and honor you and your questions. And I believe going forward that it's important for all of us to just appreciate who we are and to recognize that, you know, as Malcolm said at the end of the Oxford address, irrespective of your background, your religion, your race, your culture, who you are, how you identify. At the end of the day, this world is and continues to be in a miserable condition. But that doesn't have to be the end of the story. If we unite and come together in a revolutionary spirit through love, we can change the conditions of this earth. And so I thank you for participating and being here and supporting this event and all of the events at Eagleton. And I also want to thank Max and Randy at Eagleton, who've helped, and Benjamin and everyone else who've been involved in putting this together, and John Weingart. I want to thank all of them for their kindness and helping Eagleton to address these issues in a public forum. I think it's so important. So I want to thank all of them as well.
Thank you again, everyone. Take care. That's the conclusion of our conversation. Be well out there. Thank you. Peace.
Peace.